The waters are churning in one of the most dangerous maritime choke points on Earth, and what's unfolding right now in February 2026 could reshape global power forever. Picture this: warships from three of America's biggest rivals converging in the same narrow strait, where nearly 1/3 of the world's seaborne oil passes every single day. Chinese destroyers cutting through the waves alongside Russian corvettes, while Iranian gunboats swarm beneath the shadow of their bigger allies. The headlines scream control, the rumors whisper takeover, and the world watches with held breath as the Gulf of Oman becomes the stage for a confrontation that could ignite at any moment. But here's what you need to understand right now, before we go any further. The reality of what's happening in these waters is far more complex, far more dangerous, and far more revealing about the future of global power than any simple headline could ever capture. So let's cut through the noise and dive deep into what's really going on in the Gulf of Oman, because the truth is both more nuanced and more alarming than you might think.
Before we go further, I need to be clear about something. What you're seeing here is only the public layer of this story. For channel members, I break down what happens next, the timelines decision makers are actually working with, and the scenarios that won't be discussed openly. If you want access to that deeper analysis, you can join the channel by clicking the join button below.
Right now, as we speak in early February 2026, the Gulf of Oman is witnessing something extraordinary. Iranian state media announced just days ago that the 8th edition of the Maritime Security Belt exercise is underway, bringing together naval forces from Iran, China, and Russia in what they're calling a demonstration of maritime security cooperation. The timing couldn't be more provocative. These exercises are happening at the exact moment when tensions between Tehran and Washington have reached a boiling point, when President Trump has positioned a massive naval strike group in the region, and when the world is genuinely wondering if we're about to witness a major military confrontation in the Middle East. The Iranian Navy commander, Rear Admiral Shahram Irani, stood before cameras and declared that this exercise would enhance maritime security and strengthen cooperation among the participating countries. Chinese state media echoed similar sentiments. Russian Defense Ministry statements emphasized joint operational capabilities and regional stability. But if you think these exercises are just routine naval drills, you're missing the bigger picture entirely. Let me take you back to where this all started. The Maritime Security Belt exercises didn't just appear out of nowhere in 2026. They began back in 2019. That first exercise in December 2019 was relatively modest, involving a handful of ships from the three nations conducting basic maneuvers in the northern Indian Ocean. But what made it significant wasn't the scale, it was the symbolism. Here were three countries coming together in one of the world's most strategic waterways to send a very clear message. We can cooperate, we can coordinate, and we're not intimidated by American naval power. They've grown in scope, in complexity, and in their geopolitical significance. The 2025 edition, which took place just last March near Iran's Chabahar port, involved approximately 15 ships, support vessels, and combat boats, along with naval aviation helicopters. We're talking about Chinese Type 052DL guided missile destroyers like the Bao-2, Iranian frigates including the Alvand and Jamarin, and Russian corvettes such as the hero of the Russian Federation Aldar Tsaydinjapov and the Resky, all operating together in coordinated formations. What exactly do these exercises involve? This isn't just ships sailing in formation for the cameras. The drills include live fire exercises, where vessels conduct daytime and nighttime shooting operations against aerial targets, simulating unmanned boats and drones. There are visit, board, search, and seizure scenarios, which is military speak for practicing how to intercept and board suspect vessels. The ships practice coordinated maneuvers, communication protocols, and tactical formations. Observers from countries including Pakistan, Oman, South Africa, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Qatar, Iraq, the United Arab Emirates, and Sri Lanka were present, watching these drills unfold. This level of complexity and the presence of international observers tells us something crucial. These aren't symbolic gestures anymore. Now let's talk about what's happening right this moment in February 2026. The announced 8th edition of Maritime Security Belt is scheduled for late February in the northern Indian Ocean and Gulf of Oman region, involving units from Iran's regular navy, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, and naval forces from both China and Russia. The Chinese participants are expected to be drawn from the People's Liberation Army Navy's 48th Flotilla, currently based out of Djibouti, which includes the Type 052DL guided missile destroyer Tangshan, the Type 054A guided missile frigate Docking, and the Type 903A replenishment ship Taihu. On the Russian side, analysts predict the involvement of the Udaloy-class frigate Marshal Shaposhnikov, which has remained in the region after participating in a defense exhibition, supported by the Boris Chilikin-class oiler Boris Potoma. There's also speculation that the Steregushchi-class corvette Stoichi could join or replace these vessels, Naval control of a waterway doesn't mean simply having ships present or conducting exercises there. It means having the sustained capability to deny access to other nations, to enforce your rules over international waters, regardless of how dramatic the exercises might appear. Let me explain why, with concrete facts, that completely changed the narrative. The United States Fifth Fleet, headquartered in Manama, Bahrain, maintains continuous operational control over maritime forces throughout the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, the Gulf of Oman, and significant portions of the Indian Ocean. This isn't a temporary deployment or an exercise. This is permanent presence backed by decades of infrastructure, alliances, and military capability. The Fifth Fleet operates under international maritime law to maintain what they call secure and safe international waters for commercial shipping, conduct anti-piracy operations, and maintain combat readiness for potential conflicts. Originally deployed as part of Operation Iraqi Freedom, but kept in place ever since, with deep roots, extensive experience, and overwhelming capability. Presence right now in February 2026, accompanied by 3 destroyers, specifically to bolster regional security and deterrence amid escalating tensions with Iran. This carrier strike group represents more firepower than the entire navies of most countries on Earth. Supported by destroyers equipped with advanced missile defense systems, submarine capabilities, and a full spectrum of modern naval warfare technology. Additional naval assets have been positioned near the Strait of Hormuz and throughout the eastern Mediterranean, with reinforcements arriving successively according to reports from the Washington Post citing U.S. officials. This is what real naval power projection looks like. Sustained presence backed by overwhelming capability and the infrastructure to maintain it indefinitely. What happened on February 1st and 3rd of this year perfectly illustrates who actually controls these waters. On February 1st, an Iranian drone approached the USS Abraham Lincoln in the Arabian Sea, about 500 miles off Iranian shores. According to Pentagon spokesperson statements, the drone aggressively approached the carrier, prompting U.S. forces to shoot it down. The Iranians were conducting surveillance, trying to monitor American naval movements. Then, on February 3rd, something even more revealing occurred in the Strait of Hormuz itself. These gunboats hailed the tanker's master over VHF radio, ordering the vessel to stop engines and prepare to be boarded. The captain of the Stina Imperative ignored the Iranian demands. The Iranian gunboats backed off immediately. Think about what that tells us. Iranian forces attempted to intercept a commercial vessel in another country's territorial waters, and the moment a U.S. warship appeared, they withdrew. That's not control, that's frustrated impotence in the face of superior power. So if China, Russia, and Iran don't actually control the Gulf of Oman, what are these exercises really about? What are they trying to achieve, and why should we care? Political systems and national interests? China imports massive quantities of oil and gas through the Strait of Hormuz and across these waters. Any disruption to these shipping lanes poses an existential threat to Chinese economic security. By participating in exercises in the Gulf of Oman, first to its own people and to energy exporters in the Gulf, China is demonstrating its commitment to protecting these vital trade routes. Second, to the United States. For Russia, these exercises serve different but complementary purposes. Russia's naval presence in the Middle East and Indian Ocean has always been limited compared to the Soviet era. Modern Russia lacks the resources to maintain a permanent, large-scale naval presence in distant waters the way the United States does. But by participating in these exercises, Russia maintains relevance, demonstrates continued great power status, and reinforces strategic partnerships with both Iran and China. The exercises also provide valuable operational experience for Russian naval personnel, allow them to test weapons and communication systems in a multinational environment, and strategic options in a region where they've historically struggled to project sustained power. For Iran, these exercises are absolutely critical, perhaps more so than for either China or Russia, and understanding why requires grasping Iran's strategic predicament. Iran faces overwhelming American military superiority in every conventional measure of power. The U.S. Navy alone could devastate Iran's naval forces, air force, and coastal infrastructure within days, if not hours, of the start of a conflict. Iran knows this. American commanders know this. And everyone involved in Middle Eastern security calculations knows this. So Iran's strategy has always relied on asymmetric warfare, on threatening capabilities that could impose massive costs, even in defeat. The threat to close the Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 1/3 of global seaborne oil passes, has been Iran's ultimate strategic lever. But can Iran actually close the strait? Could they really shut down global oil flows? The honest answer is probably not for any sustained period, and definitely not if the United States and its allies commit to keeping it open. But Iran can make passage dangerous, costly, and uncertain. They can deploy mines, launch anti-ship missiles from mobile launchers hidden along the coast, swarm commercial vessels with fast attack boats, and generally create enough chaos and risk that insurance rates skyrocket and shipping companies think twice about transiting the area. What Iran gains from these exercises with China and Russia is the appearance of great power backing. the suggestion that any American action against Iran might trigger wider confrontation with Beijing and Moscow. It's deterrence through association, strategic ambiguity about how far China and Russia would go to support Iran in a crisis. But let's be very clear about something crucial, something that often gets lost in analysis of these geopolitical chess moves. Neither China nor Russia has shown any indication that they would directly intervene militarily to save Iran's regime if the United States decided to launch strikes. China has economic interests in Iran, absolutely. China is Iran's largest trading partner and a major buyer of Iranian oil despite sanctions. Russia has strategic interests in maintaining Iran as a partner and a source of instability that distracts and burdens the United States. But neither country has committed to defend Iran militarily, neither has signed a mutual defense treaty, and neither has given any guarantee that they would risk direct confrontation with the United States over Iran. What China and Russia offer Iran is diplomatic support at the United Nations, some degree of economic lifeline through continued trade, despite sanctions, surveillance and drone technology that helps Iran monitor threats and suppress internal dissent, and the symbolic solidarity of these joint exercises. But it's a far cry from a military alliance that would actually control waterways or defend Iran from American strikes. President Trump has made multiple statements about time running out for the Iranian regime. He's pinned posts on Truth Social warning that a massive armada is moving toward Iran. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt has stated publicly that while the administration prefers diplomacy, military airstrikes remain on the table as an option. The administration imposed a 25% tariff on any country doing business with Iran, an economic warfare measure designed to isolate Tehran completely. Meanwhile, inside Iran, the situation has grown increasingly volatile. Initially sparked by economic grievances, but evolving into broader challenges to the regime's legitimacy. With reports suggesting around 2,000 people have been killed in the crackdown, Iranian officials have issued warnings that they're ready for war, and that any attack on Iranian interests would be met with swift and decisive response. Iranian vice president's statements emphasize that Iran must be prepared for war. Into this powder keg of tension drops the announcement of joint naval exercises by Iran, China, and Russia. The timing is clearly deliberate. Iran wants to signal that it's not isolated, that it has powerful friends, that any American action carries risks of wider escalation. China and Russia, by proceeding with the exercises, despite American warnings and despite the tense atmosphere, are sending their own signals. They're demonstrating that they won't be intimidated by American military posturing, that they'll maintain their strategic partnerships regardless of Washington's preferences, and that the era of uncontested American dominance in regions like the Middle East is over. But here's what's crucial to understand. Signaling is not the same as control, demonstrations are not the same as dominance, and exercises are not the same as permanent presence. The exercises will last days or perhaps a couple of weeks at most. The ships will conduct their drills. The three nations will issue statements about successful cooperation and enhanced capabilities. They'll go back to their home ports or to other deployment areas because neither China nor Russia maintains the infrastructure, the alliances, the supply chains, or the strategic commitment to keep substantial naval forces permanently deployed in the Gulf of Oman the way the United States does through the Fifth Fleet. Let me give you some specific numbers that illustrate the actual balance of power in these waters, because numbers don't lie and they cut through rhetoric pretty effectively. The United States' Fifth Fleet area of operations covers approximately 2.5 million square miles. At any given time, the Fifth Fleet commands roughly 20 ships, 60 aircraft, and about 21,000 personnel, though these numbers fluctuate based on operational requirements. And those ships are only present for the duration of the exercise. They have formal alliances and security partnerships with Bahrain, which hosts the Fifth Fleet headquarters, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, Oman, and Saudi Arabia. These relationships include access to ports, airfields, intelligence sharing, joint exercises that happen year-round, not just occasionally, and integrated command structures. That's the infrastructure of actual control, of sustained presence, of the capability to project power, not just for a week or two, but indefinitely. The Gulf Cooperation Council, which includes Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, has significantly bolstered its sea and air defense capabilities around the Strait of Hormuz over recent years, led primarily by Saudi and Kuwaiti arms purchases. These nations have a collective security arrangement where an act of aggression toward one is considered an act toward all. And critically, they're aligned with the United States, not with Iran, China, or Russia. When push comes to shove, when actual control of the waterways is contested, these regional powers will support the American-led security architecture because their own survival depends on it. The monarchies of the Gulf see Iran as their primary threat. They see American naval power as their primary protection. And they have no interest in seeing Chinese or Russian influence replace American presence in their neighborhood. Now, let's talk about what would actually happen if Iran tried to close the Strait of Hormuz, because this scenario is the ultimate test of who really controls these waters. Multiple expert analyses, including from energy consultancy KPLR and other maritime security firms, suggest that while Iran can threaten closure and could create temporary disruption, they likely don't have the capability to fully close the strait for any sustained period, given how the U.S. Navy is patrolling the area, even in a scenario where Iran attempted temporary disruption through harassment of tankers or brief blocking of transit. The physical impact on supply would be limited. Current estimates show the oil market tilting toward oversupply, with roughly 2.5 million barrels per day of excess supply in January and over 3 million barrels per day in February and March 2026. This means the global market has some buffer to absorb temporary disruptions. More importantly, any closure attempt would almost certainly be met with overwhelming force by the United States and its allies to restore flows immediately. The United States has made absolutely clear, in its national security strategy and in countless statements from military and civilian leaders, that ensuring Gulf energy supplies don't fall into enemy hands and that the Strait of Hormuz remains open is a core American interest. This isn't negotiable, it's not subject to diplomacy. It's a red line backed by the full spectrum of American military power. Think about what that means in practical terms. If Iran mined the strait, the U.S. Navy has some of the world's most advanced mine-clearing capabilities and could deploy them within hours. If Iran launched anti-ship missiles from coastal positions, American air power could destroy those launch sites before they got off more than a few shots. If Iranian fast attack boats tried to swarm commercial vessels, American destroyers and aircraft would sink them systematically. Iran might inflict some damage, might sink a ship or two, might create a few days of panic and spiking oil prices, but they couldn't sustain closure against determined American action to reopen the waterway. And here's the ultimate question. Would China and Russia intervene militarily to help Iran keep the strait closed? Would Chinese destroyers engage American warships to defend Iranian mining operations? Would Russian corvettes fire on U.S. Navy vessels to protect Iranian gunboats? The answer, based on everything we know about Chinese and Russian strategic calculations, is almost certainly no. Both nations would condemn American military action diplomatically. Both would probably impose some economic costs or political complications for the United States, but neither would risk direct military confrontation with American naval power over Iran's attempt to close a waterway that both China and Russia also depend on for energy imports. So what does all this mean? Why does it matter that China, Russia, and Iran are conducting naval exercises in the Gulf of Oman if they don't actually control the waterway and probably wouldn't directly fight the United States there? It matters because it represents something bigger than any single exercise or confrontation. It represents the gradual erosion of American dominance, not through dramatic takeover or military victory, but through persistent challenge, through the slow accumulation of alternatives, through the patient building of relationships and capabilities that weren't there before. 20 years ago, the idea of Chinese warships regularly operating in the Gulf of Oman would have been almost unthinkable. China's navy was primarily focused on coastal defense and lacked the capabilities for sustained operations far from Chinese shores. Today, Chinese destroyers routinely deploy to the Indian Ocean, maintain anti-piracy patrols off Somalia, and participate in exercises with partners across the region. That's a fundamental shift in Chinese naval capability and ambition. Similarly, while Russia had a Soviet-era global naval presence, the post-Soviet Russian Navy largely retreated to near waters for 2 decades. Seeing Russian warships operating in the Gulf of Oman alongside Chinese and Iranian vessels represents a partial recovery of Russian global reach, even if it's still limited compared to American capabilities. For Iran, these exercises serve multiple purposes beyond just deterrence or symbolic solidarity. They provide genuine operational benefits through the sharing of tactics, testing of equipment in multinational environments, and building personal relationships between naval officers from the 3 countries. In any future crisis, having Chinese and Russian naval personnel who've exercised with Iranian counterparts who know Iranian officers personally, who've operated together in these waters, creates networks and understanding that could matter. It doesn't mean China or Russia would fight for Iran, but it might mean better communication in a crisis, more nuanced understanding of each other's capabilities and intentions, and potentially more effective coordination if all 3 nations found themselves opposed to American actions for their own separate reasons. The exercises also send messages to other regional actors. Countries watching these drills have to factor in the possibility of deeper China-Russia-Iran cooperation. They have to wonder whether aligning too closely with the United States might eventually put them at odds with rising powers. This creates strategic uncertainty, which is valuable in itself. The question we should be asking isn't whether China, Russia, and Iran control the Gulf of Oman, because they clearly don't by any meaningful measure. The question is whether the trajectory we're seeing, The pattern of increasing cooperation and capability among these three powers represents a fundamental challenge to American maritime dominance over the long term. And here the answer is more complex and potentially more concerning. American naval dominance has rested on several pillars: overwhelming technological superiority, the ability to maintain presence globally through a network of bases and allies, superior training and operational experience, and ultimately the political will to use force to maintain access to strategic waterways. Some of these pillars remain rock solid. American technological superiority in naval warfare is still substantial, though the gap has narrowed in certain areas like hypersonic missiles and integrated air defense systems. American alliance networks remain robust, especially in the Gulf, where regional powers depend on U.S. security guarantees. American operational experience and training quality are still unmatched, but the political will factor is increasingly uncertain. After 2 decades of wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, after economic challenges at home, after growing domestic polarization about America's role in the world, would the United States actually go to war to keep the Strait of Hormuz open if China and Russia signaled that such action might trigger wider confrontation? The betting would probably still be yes, America would act, but the certainty isn't what it once was. That erosion of certainty, that growing question mark about American resolve, is itself a form of lost dominance even if American capabilities remain superior. The broader geopolitical context of BRICS expansion matters here too. The Will for Peace exercise that preceded these maritime security belt drills, conducted off South Africa in January, marked the first serious defense cooperation initiative under the BRICS framework. BRICS started as an economic grouping of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, but it's gradually evolving into something more comprehensive, including security cooperation. The fact that these naval exercises are increasingly framed within the BRICS context suggests an attempt to institutionalize alternatives to Western-led security structures. It's not NATO, not even close in terms of integration or capability, but it's the beginning of something different. And beginnings matter, trajectories matter. The question isn't where things stand today in February 2026, it's where they might stand in 2030, 2035, 2040 if current trends continue. If China continues building naval capability and extending its operational reach, if Russia continues recovering its global presence despite economic constraints, if Iran continues developing asymmetric capabilities and deepening ties with both powers, if BRICS continues expanding and incorporating security dimensions alongside economic cooperation, then the maritime balance of power in critical regions like the Gulf of Oman could look very different a decade from now. Let's also talk about what's happening with other actors in the region, because the competition for influence in the Gulf extends beyond just the major powers. Countries like Pakistan, Oman, and the UAE sent observers to these exercises, which tells us they're hedging their bets, maintaining relationships with both the American security architecture and with the China-Russia-Iran alignment. This hedging behavior by middle powers is precisely what American strategists worry about most. It doesn't mean these countries are abandoning partnerships with Washington, but it means they're keeping options open, building ties with other powers, creating strategic flexibility for an uncertain future. When middle powers hedge rather than align definitively, it reduces the effectiveness of alliance systems and increases the complexity and cost of maintaining dominance. American military presence becomes more expensive and less effective when it can't fully rely on regional partners, when those partners are simultaneously building relationships with rivals, when strategic clarity gets replaced by ambiguity and hedging. The economic dimension of all this matters enormously too. China has become Iran's lifeline economically despite American sanctions. Chinese purchases of Iranian oil have kept Iran's economy from total collapse. Chinese investment in Iranian infrastructure, Chinese technology exports to Iran, Chinese financial mechanisms that allow Iran to continue trading despite being cut off from Western banking systems. All of this creates dependencies and relationships that have strategic implications. When China has massive economic interests in Iran, when Chinese companies are deeply involved in Iranian energy sectors, when Chinese technology underpins Iranian surveillance and military systems, that creates a different kind of leverage and a different calculation about how far China might go to protect those interests. It's not military alliance, but it's something more than just symbolic exercises. Similarly, Russia's relationship with Iran has deepened through shared opposition to American policies, through arms sales, including advanced air defense systems, through intelligence sharing and diplomatic coordination. These relationships matter because they create networks of interest and interaction that didn't exist 2 decades ago. What about the human dimension, the actual sailors and officers participating in these exercises? For Iranian naval personnel, working alongside Chinese and Russian counterparts provides insights into how modern blue water navies operate. Iranian officers get to see Chinese naval technology up close, learn tactics that work for ships operating far from home, and build professional relationships with experienced sailors from major powers. For Chinese participants, these exercises provide valuable operational experience in waters far from home, test their logistics and sustainability in extended deployments, and build the institutional knowledge needed to project power globally. Chinese sailors who've conducted live fire exercises in the Gulf of Oman go back to China with experience that informs training, procurement decisions, and operational planning. For Russian personnel, maintaining presence in the Indian Ocean and Persian Gulf keeps skills and institutional knowledge alive, prevents the complete loss of global operational capability, and reinforces Russia's self-image as a great power. All of these human-level interactions and experiences accumulate over time into real capability development. As we look ahead to the rest of 2026 and beyond, several scenarios are possible. In the most optimistic scenario from an American perspective, these exercises remain largely symbolic. Tensions with Iran gradually de-escalate through some combination of diplomacy and deterrence. China and Russia continue to prioritize their own core interests over challenging American dominance in the Gulf, and the regional order remains fundamentally intact with American maritime supremacy unchallenged. In this scenario, we look back in a few years and see Maritime Security Belt 2026 as just another exercise in a long series of exercises that didn't fundamentally change anything. In a more concerning scenario, the exercises represent the leading edge of genuine strategic coordination among China, Russia, and Iran. Perhaps a crisis emerges, maybe over Taiwan or Ukraine or Iran itself. And these three powers find themselves coordinating not just naval exercises, but actual opposition to American actions. In this scenario, the relationships built through these exercises matter enormously because they provide the foundation for more serious cooperation. The middle scenario, probably the most likely, is continued gradual erosion of American dominance through 1,000 small challenges and adjustments, with these exercises being one of many data points showing the slow shift in global power balances. The ultimate reality, the truth we need to grapple with, is that the Gulf of Oman in February 2026 is not under China-Russia-Iran control in any meaningful military or territorial sense. American naval power remains dominant, American alliances remain strong, and the infrastructure of American maritime supremacy in the region remains intact. But the very fact that we're having this conversation, that headlines can plausibly suggest rival powers might control these waters, that China and Russia can operate warships alongside Iran in exercises near the Strait of Hormuz without triggering American military response, tells us something important about how the world has changed. 20 years ago, such exercises would have been unthinkable. Today, they're routine. What becomes routine tomorrow might be even more challenging to American interests. The trajectory matters as much as the current position. Naval dominance isn't just about who wins battles. It's about who can maintain presence, who can afford to stay engaged, who allies trust, and who has the political will to use force when necessary. On all those dimensions, except perhaps political will, America remains supreme in the Gulf of Oman. But supremacy isn't the same as certainty, dominance isn't the same as inevitability, and current advantage doesn't guarantee future control. The waters of the Gulf of Oman continue to flow, carrying oil tankers and warships, witnesses to the slow-motion contest between established power and rising challengers, between American dominance and the gradual emergence of alternatives. And while the headlines scream control and take over, the reality is something both more subtle and more significant. The patient, persistent challenge to an order that once seemed unchallengeable, the slow accumulation of capabilities and relationships that might matter enormously when the next real crisis comes.